I've just come across an interesting discussion on the Young Turks channel. I believe I've spoken a little bit about them before. I occasionally watch their videos. I don't always like their style. Sometimes they're a little bit too self-righteous and sarcastic. However, this particular discussion I think was interesting, and they raised a number of good points. The discussion basically was about the whole concept of women and children first. And it's a scenario we often see in terms of disasters, especially maritime disasters. Of course, the common thing that people refer to in that is the Titanic. I think the discussion is definitely relevant because I believe I made another video about whether or not aspects of the media, well, large aspects of the media, is very widespread, sort of take indifference to male suffering, almost as if men are expendable. Very often when you hear about some sort of transport accident or a terrorist attack, you will hear something like, let's say, 64 people killed, at least 20 women and children were among the dead. That's just an example. So that means, oh, never mind the 44 men who also died. Now, I think most people would agree children is quite straight cut. Children are very young people who are just in the very beginning of their life. They're the future generation. I think very few people would debate that children have a right to live, and that goes without saying. However, when it comes to the gender thing of adult men and women, that gets a bit more complex. For me, I'm torn on this issue. I have to say I'm somewhat old-fashioned in the sense that I still have a chivalrous instinct. Now, what I mean by that is I would like to think, in my own values, that if there was some sort of major incident and it was a case of having to save your life, if I was with a female friend, for example, especially if I was with the woman I loved or my girlfriend, but even a female friend, I'd like to think I wanted to make sure that she was safe. Now, I can imagine a lot of people would sort of frown upon that idea because chivalry is also seen as something that's rather archaic. Obviously, the best outcome would be I could protect her and myself. I've no desire to die. But if it was a situation where it was me or her, I don't know. Thankfully, I've never been in this situation, but I honestly believe I don't know. Because then the question would be, would I live with myself if I saved myself and let a woman die who I could have saved, something like that. So a lot of it comes into gender sort of identity. I think the best outcome would be there should be a safety situation whereby everyone ideally could be saved. So there wouldn't have to be this question of who gets priority. They actually discussed issues that went beyond just gender. They also discussed, for example, health, age, etc. Then there's an argument to be made, for example, say you have a 41-year-old man and a 28-year-old man. Some would say, well, the 41-year-old has had a longer life, so he's had more life. The younger man deserves to live more. But then others say, well, the 41-year-old has two young children, or he's a single father, therefore he has dependents. Whereas the younger man might be single, and Cenk Uygur, I can't pronounce the guy's name, the main host of the Young Turks, this main co-host I should say, pointed out, well, that's unfair on single people. And you occasionally see that in films as well. I remember in the action film Speed, there's a scene where one passenger on the bus, which is taken hostage if you know the film, gets quite frustrated and he said, oh, let's see, because I'm a single guy I deserve to die, I'm expendable, and he sort of gets annoyed. And that comes after an older man says, hey man, I have kids. Like, it's sort of the argument of course would be it's not so much about him, it's about the dependents, which is the children. But ideally there should be a situation where as many lives as possible are saved, so there wouldn't be the need for discrimination in the first place. that would be the ideal situation, but it's not a perfect world, and occasionally there are situations whereby those sort of questions come about. Another thing would be, well, what if you have, say, a healthy young person or a frail old person? Again, the old person has had more life, but the younger person has more chance of surviving because they're physically stronger. Then what if the question is a healthy 25-year-old woman versus a frail 75-year-old man? Who gets the priority there? He's an old man and he's frail, but he's a man. She's a young woman and she's healthy, but she's a woman, so who gets the priority? Now the idea comes about from the view that the average woman is weaker than the average man. Obviously there's exceptions, there's women in the military and so on, but we're talking in terms of average people here. So it's definitely an interesting debate. I would say one thing, I get frustrated sometimes when I hear the feminist movement talk about I don't think you can have this discussion without bringing feminism into it. Of course it's relevant. And I sometimes hear, we often hear about male privilege throughout history. And what that refers to is traditional patriarchy, where men had voting rights, men had ownership rights. In many areas, men did have more civic rights. That goes without saying. However, what I believe the feminist movement hugely overlooks is the fact that throughout history, and I think this is a very important point, and it's something that's sometimes forgotten, throughout history, in every part of the world, every culture, almost every culture, there are examples of brave men who have sacrificed their lives in order to defend a woman or women. There's countless examples throughout history, and I think when feminists talk about male privilege and ignore that fact, that's actually a bit callous, because it's ignoring male sacrifice so that women could live. One of the great propaganda pushes of World War I was to defend women, because there was the sort of issue of the so-called rape of Belgium, when Belgium was pillaged by German forces and the Germans were dehumanized as these mad brutes who were killing women and children. And that's what actually happened itself is debatable, but the point I'm making is that that was used as a recruitment drive in order to encourage Frenchmen, Englishmen, British men I should say, to sign up to protect our women from the German Hun, etc. And that's just one example. There's many, many examples throughout history. So the notion of protecting women has always been used to try and pressure young men to sign up. The understanding being that if they don't sign up, they're not real men, because they're not man enough to show that they care for the fair sex. That sort of idea. So definitely gender modelling is a big part of it, and I think that comes into both patriarchy and feminism. I don't blame feminism for that. However, I blame patriarchy for that, but I do believe the feminist movement is guilty of callously ignoring male sacrifice. Because when feminists go on about male privilege throughout history, I think, well, okay, there has been male privilege, but what about all the male sacrifice? Why is it the feminist movement ignores that? So I do take issue with that sort of distortion. And I think it's grossly disrespectful to those brave men who did risk their lives, and in many cases did die for women. I'm sure there's examples as well of women who died for their children, and maybe very rarely for men, but I think it's fair to say overall it's more been a case of men have been expected to protect women. I think that goes without saying. So it's a question of what is fair, what is perceived, what is the role in all of this of chivalry, feminism, etc. And a lot of people would say chivalry is an old-fashioned concept. I think it is, and I can understand why a lot of men would get just as annoyed by that as they would by feminism, but I don't know. I don't have a major problem with chivalry, actually. I think it's almost refreshing. I have no problem being protective of women. Obviously not smothering, that's a very different issue. But the problem is that in itself is no longer trusted, because women think, oh well, what's his intention? Like, the idea is, if the man is protective, if a man who isn't your husband or boyfriend is protective, then he must just want sex. Whereas it might well be a case that he's just a decent guy and he wants to make sure you're okay. For example, if you're walking home alone at night, something like that. So there's a lot of interesting questions to be asked in this debate. But the idea of women and children first, children I can definitely understand. With women, I personally would probably want to make sure that my lady and female friends were safe, but not necessarily at the price of dying myself. Of course, I'd also want to survive. And like I say, it's not just a gender issue, because then it comes into who should live and who should die. It's a very cold sort of thing, but unfortunately in some circumstances that situation is inevitable. So what's my conclusion? My conclusion is, well, I don't actually have one. Let me know your thoughts on this. Is women and children first, is that still a valid philosophy in this day and age? That's the first question. The second question, why does the media seem to discriminate against male victims of terrorism, of transport disasters? Now, actually, I forgot to mention an important point. They raise the fact that throughout history, men have generally been the combatants, the soldiers, etc. Women have generally been the defenseless victims. Therefore, any army or any combatant that targeted women and children would be absolutely vilified, because they're seen as attacking the vulnerable. Whereas if an insurgent kills a soldier, well, that's sort of seen as, yeah, he was a brave man, but he was a soldier, kind of thing, and he's an armed combatant, so it's different. But if a defenseless woman is killed, she's defenseless, that's the point. However, then the question would be, well, what about situations where you have a terrorist attacking a marketplace, and then dozens of civilians die, and in many cases you have like barbers, stall vendors, etc., many of them men. Those men aren't combatants. So I think it's mistaken to assume that just because a man is in war, he must be a combatant. And I'm not just talking about older men, I'm talking about, there's plenty of younger men who are not combatants in war. So I think it's misguided to automatically assume that just because a man is a man in a war situation, he must be either a soldier or an insurgent. It may well be he is a male civilian, in which case he is a civilian. So surely his death should be just as controversial as the death of any other civilian, because an unarmed man is just as defenseless in that context, i.e. from a drone or from a bomb, as a woman. Another situation would be on a plane. A male passenger is just as vulnerable as a woman if that plane plummets 30,000 feet and crashes into a mountain. Being slightly physically stronger is not going to save you in that situation. So there's certain scenarios where life and death is just blunt and cut like that. You could be a male bodybuilder and you wouldn't survive in that situation. But then it all comes down to likelihood of survivability, if that's a real word. Anyway, I'll put a link to that discussion that they had on the Young Turks. I know I should apologise, in a lot of my videos I waffle on and on. I think it's just because I want to include a lot of valid points, so I do know that my videos are maybe a bit longer than they should be, because I looked at my viewer retention and that's a bit of a problem, so I'm going to try and make them a bit shorter if I can. But the only reason I try to fill the full bandwidth is because there's a lot of areas I want to cover, and I always have a concern that I'll post a video and then there'll be something I've forgotten to say. So that's the reason I do that. Let me know your thoughts on this. Final thought of my own. In my own situation, I believe I would be traditional and protective of Certainly women I know. It may be different with female strangers, although I think even then I would feel a moral obligation to do it, because I feel that society would judge me if I didn't. And that's another issue I think there's a lot of pressure on men to conform to that. So let me know your thoughts on this. Thank you.